Hi, everyone. Again, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the future of foreign influence. There is a lot happening in this realm, I think, as everyone well knows, just as recently as the last few weeks with Innovation and Competition Act passing, heading over to the House. Certainly don't think that this topic is going to slow down anytime soon. Today, we're going to provide an overview of this regulatory and enforcement climate, but really we want to spend most of our time discussing how to really think through the application of research security programs at your institution, thinking about your risk tolerance, balancing that with the resources that you have, and kind of talking about different approaches that folks are doing, and making sure that the program you're putting together is really aligned to your institution. We know there's a lot being asked of institutions. We know that institutions are constantly functioning with limited resources. So we really want to give some thoughts around strategizing and prioritizing how to approach this. And again, just kind of make sure that the program you're putting together is really tailored to your institution's profile and kind of what you're comfortable with. Just quickly on logistics, we are going to be sending out a recording of this webinar in about a week, so we're happy to take any questions throughout as well. So please feel free to use the Q&A function as you're engaging with the content. All right. I'm Amanda Ferguson. I'm a director at Huron. I've been in research administration and compliance for about 10 years. I started off working at an academic medical center in a compliance office, and then have continued to work in research compliance and broader compliance related activities since being at Huron. Spending a lot of time recently talking about things like export controls, conflicts of interest and commitment, and then some of this broader foreign influence and research security work as well. And I'm really excited to be joined today by Christine and Mark. Christine, I'll ask you to introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Really nice to see that we've got so many participants today. My name's Christine Savage. I'm a partner at Choate, Holland Stewart. I've been with the firm for a little over 25 years and really have worked with research institutions and academic medical centers throughout my tenure at the firm. I've spent a lot of my practice in the last 2 years focused on issues related to foreign influence, both from a compliance and investigation side, as well as dealing with enforcement actions involving individuals who are either faculty members or researchers at some of our institutional clients. Mark?
Yes, I'm Mark McPherson. Thanks for having me today. I'm a senior associate at Choate here in Boston. I work primarily in white-collar criminal defense and investigations, and I've worked with Christine on a number of matters involving foreign influence and federally funded research.
Awesome. Thanks, all. Mark, I think grew a pandemic beard, so excited to see that. All right, we wanted to just get started with a quick polling question. One of the things we're curious about is looking at whether your institution has started to put together some of these working groups and kind of cross-functional teams. I think one of the really clear things about foreign influence and research security is that these risks really live throughout the institution. It's not something that research can just own by itself, or that a compliance office or even general counsel could own by yourselves. It's something that really has an impact throughout the institution. So we would love to hear from all of y'all if you've kind of taken any of these steps to begin with. It'll give us some good insight as to whether kind of how to tailor our comments throughout the webinar. All right, Grace, if you want to show the results, that would be great. All right, so it looks like 75%, 76% have actually convened a group, which is great. I think that's a really great starting point. And then a handful, just about a quarter, have not yet. So definitely something to be considering as you start to think about your program and putting that together. But we'll spend a little bit more time talking about that as we move through the presentation. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Christine to give some updates on the NIH notices.
Thanks, Amanda. So hopefully by now, most of you are familiar with NIH notices 2173 and 21110, which have updated the format and the content requirements for both biosketches and other support pages. We won't go through all of the changes and features, but wanted to highlight here a few critical features that may impact how individuals are completing these documents and the role that the institution plays in making sure that they're completed correctly. First, the Biosketch format is now updated to include a section for scientific appointments, which had not been called out specifically in the past. These are to be listed in reverse chronological order. And so we wish you all luck working with investigators to get things in the right format and to helping them do that. Second is the separation of in-kind contributions from funded support in the other support page. And some guidance that's provided about what constitutes in-kind support. And we really think about it in terms of 4 categories: space, equipment, supplies, and people. And so all of those things now need to be listed on the other support page, which I think many of us will concede, are not things that, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, people were even keeping track of, let alone disclosing on another support page. And so there's certainly opportunities for education and training in that space, as well as monitoring and auditing moving forward. The third, and really this is a critical feature, and particularly for the enforcement work that Mark and I do, is a requirement that will be in place that PIs and key personnel must sign and certify as to the completeness and accuracy of their other support page. I can say that even outside the sphere of undue foreign influence, I've had many cases where PIs or other personnel assert that they themselves don't compile their other support page. They may not even review their other support page, and they delegate that to research administration or sponsored programs, and try to deflect any responsibility or blame for errors or omissions. This new requirement will really help shift the onus to individual investigators. Again, it's going to require a fair amount of education and training, but I think really important in terms of trying to get investigator buy-in on why they need to care about these documents. The next relates to, and we'll talk about this a couple of times throughout today's program, supporting documents for foreign other support, such that if a PI or someone else has an agreement that is from a foreign institution or from a foreign government, they need to provide a copy of that arrangement, and it needs to be in English. And so if you only have something in the native language of the country involved, you're going to have to get that translated in some form or fashion. NIH has said that machine translations are acceptable, but as we'll talk about a little bit later, while that may be acceptable for NIH, your institution may not be comfortable with machine translations, as I think we've all found in certain circumstances, they're not 100% reliable, and oftentimes can result in things looking fairly nonsensical. The last thing that I would highlight, and again, this will become important from an enforcement perspective, is that NIH is now specifically calling out that they expect institutions to notify them immediately if it is discovered that an other support page is not complete or accurate, and that something was either left out or was misstated. I think rightly so. In the past, institutions have deferred until the next RPPR, or if something was in an application, they'll wait till the just in time to make a correction. And the agency here is saying, that's not good enough. We want to know immediately, sort of contrary to NSF, which is sort of allotting sort of a 30-day window for that type of notification. So I think everyone will decide what immediately means, but it certainly won't mean more than 30 days. And, we would advocate certainly that if the omission or the error is significant, that immediate, better to say we found something that's off or wrong, we're still looking into it, but at least, we'll have a call in at the beginning. And then if you want to switch to the next slide, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the enforcement side of some of the recent legislative activity, and there has been a lot. Both the Endless Frontier Act and the Safeguarding American Innovation Act were folded into the Innovation and Competition Act of 2021. That passed the Senate on June the 8th and is now being reviewed by the House. And we'll see, sort of what happens with a number of features. There were a number of amendments thrown in at the last minute on the Senate side. But these legislative efforts do have the potential to significantly impact compliance and risk management efforts, both at an institutional and an individual level. So Amanda will speak to sort of the State Department, the export control, and Department of Education aspects. The aspect that, in my role, helping people typically in a defense posture, is really focused on concerns about federal funding for people participating in foreign talent programs, and the fact that if the act passes as it is, those will be prohibited if the talent program relates to China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea. And that prohibition, if someone then does not disclose that they have such an arrangement, there is a provision in the act that would make it a specific crime, which is a real sea change, a specific crime to fail to accurately report outside compensation or other support on a federal grant application. So as Mark will talk about in a little bit, to date, prosecutors are relying on sort of broader criminal statutes, whether it's wire fraud, mail fraud, or false statements. This would make it a specific criminal penalty, and it's a pretty harsh penalty. It's imprisonment of up to 5 years, debarment for a specified period of time, and potentially fines, personal fines for investigators of up to $250,000. So all fairly significant implications for folks. And again, something that can be translated into the educational process to help investigators understand why they need to care. So take it away, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Just to kind of further round out that conversation, Christine had shared, if the bill moves forward and kind of gets reconciled with the provisions, it will have that outright ban on foreign talent program participation for those 4 countries. There's an additional requirement that if you have anyone funded on an award who participates in a foreign talent program of another country, that you provide that contract as well. So somewhat similar to what Christine was just discussing related to the NIH notices, that this requirement for a contract provision in the award process would be kind of expanded out and kind of apply at least more specifically to those investigators that participate in foreign talent programs. There are some other pretty major aspects of this bill that we're going to touch on just briefly. The first is expanding responsible conduct of research training, expanding beyond just providing it to trainees, but to all faculty and senior personnel, and then expanding content itself to include security threats, export control, disclosure and reporting requirements. So, really looking again at expanding the number of folks who are subject to that training, but then the content of it as well. Candidly, we would say, even if the bill doesn't pass or this provision gets modified in the reconciliation process, it's probably worth taking a look at your training for faculty around research security. As you'll hear from us pretty ad nauseum, they're really the best frontline defense for your institutions. As Christine was just saying, a good opportunity to fold some of this into your educational materials. So just something to be considering, really regardless of what happens with that particular aspect of the bill. The next real major change is related to export controls and visitors. There are some provisions in the bill that would require you to establish a plan that's going to safeguard against unauthorized access for exchange visitors. Looking specifically at export control technology. So paying attention as well to the changes going on in the export control world with some of those ANPRMs that are outstanding, changing the types of technologies that are controlled. For those of you that are familiar with your I-129 process related to any of your staff that are on H-1Bs, it's worth examining that process, seeing if you'd be able to leverage anything that you've kind of already got incorporated into your operations related to that. So you can start to really prepare for the potential of pre-screening your visitors for any export control risk. Again, should this move forward. And then finally, the bill impacts Section 117 reporting. I think we've seen a lot in the Section 117 world in the last few years or so. For those of you unfamiliar, this is the report required by the Department of Education for institutions of higher education to file related to their foreign gifts and contracts. The bill lowers the reporting threshold from $250,000 to $50,000. We've seen some decent enforcement action around compliance with those reporting requirements under the Trump administration. So a lot of institutions already began to tighten their processes around the report. Ideally, if you are subject to this, you've already got a process that's going to identify the existence and the value of your foreign agreements. Figuring out how you determine that value can be a little bit tricky. So no time like the present to identify the offices that sign contracts, accept gifts for your institution, put together some SOPs that help define how you make those valuations. And then theoretically, it's just adjusting for that threshold as this moves on and if this particular provision moves forward. Somewhat in contrast to that, turning to the Strategic Competition Act, this was not part of the Innovation and Competition Act, but has been added to the legislative calendar. So another bill that we're tracking and paying attention to. This one also looks at foreign gifts and contracts, but it goes further in some ways by expanding the oversight of the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States to these gifts and contracts to higher ed institutions when they are over $1 million or in excess of $1 million over a period of 2 calendar years, if they are related to research and development of critical technologies and could provide a foreign person with access to that information. For any other lawyers or compliance folks in the audience, there's a lot of definitions packed into that brief sentence. So lots to pay attention to as far as how that bill moves forward, how those definitions kind of get worked out, either in the bill itself or in subsequent regulation. A really good thing to be partnering with your government relations offices on to pay attention to. And make sure that you're prepared to meet those requirements should this bill come to fruition. I think one of the more challenging concepts under this bill is really understanding the type of access that gets granted through various gifts or contracts. If you start to think about this from a more traditional export controls perspective, there's different levels of control that get applied based on the sensitivity of the equipment or the data, on the nationality of the person who's receiving the access. So it may be a good idea to kind of take this bill, again, as it kind of works through the process and sit down not only with government relations, but with your export control officer to start thinking about how you determine what access is provided and how you would go about kind of making that determination within your institution. All right. And then finally, we wanted to just spend a little bit of time talking about a bill that was enacted in Florida around foreign influence. Definitely not enough time to break down this bill in the course of this webinar because just candidly for this group, it's quite onerous. Some of the key provisions include disclosing foreign gifts and grants to the Florida Department of Financial Services. The requirements around what you need to disclose will vary based on whether you're a state agency or a private institution that's seeking to contract with the state. That effectively gets at all institutions of higher ed within Florida. It provides for an annual audit by their inspector general to examine at least 5% of these gifts to determine if they complied with the requirements. Then it actually creates a key TAM-like reward by offering 25% of any penalties collected from a whistleblower complaint. So really incentivizing others to pay attention to this as well. It creates a foreign travel monitoring program for any employment-related travel for faculty and researchers, likely going to force institutions into closing off the ability to book travel outside of institution systems, considering how sponsored travel fits into that requirement, so on and so forth. And then arguably one of the more burdensome components of the bill requires screening applications for any research-related employment before even making an interview and then before an offer. It's going to require the applicant to submit a huge chunk of documents. Research integrity officers are then charged with reviewing those documents and essentially conducting an open source background check. You have to submit the name of the individual to the FBI, and again, all before even going through with an interview. So it's a lot for Florida institutions, and for everyone else. I think it's really just important to know that state level activity is starting to happen while the federal government is still continuing to work this through. I think, as we all know, the disparate requirements across states can get confusing, to say nothing if the state requirements contradict or otherwise kind of come into conflict with federal requirements. So really just tricky and kind of worth tracking. One last, I guess, fun note is that the bill was signed by Governor DeSantis last week. It takes effect on July 1st. So not a lot of lead time there to really get into compliance, which is always kind of opening the door to some of these enforcement actions. And I am going to turn it over to Christine to talk about enforcement actions again, back on the federal side.
Great. And I think just before we transition to that, there were a couple of questions in the queue about foreign talent programs. Sort of, is there a definition of what is a foreign talent program? So I would refer people to the NSPM 33 and the JCOR report, which attempt to reach sort of a common definition of foreign talent programs. There are also directives within some of the legislation for federal agencies to put together a list of all of the talent programs to try to make it a little bit easier so institutions aren't guessing whether a particular program falls within that category or not. But I think that's still something that's probably going to require some additional massaging. There was another question about whether or not the pending legislation addresses what happens to people who are already members of foreign talent programs with one of those 4 countries, and does it require them to terminate the relationship? And the answer is the legislation doesn't address that at all. And so I would expect that to come forth in regulations about either having some sort of washout period for people to terminate. For those who have seen situations where people are engaged in those types of arrangements, they often don't allow the researcher to simply terminate the agreement. And we have seen some where you need the blessing of the foreign government in order to terminate those arrangements. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, for individuals and institutions seeking to send termination notices and whether those are accepted or not.
Yeah, and Christine, I can field some of these other ones around the training requirements and export controls. As it relates to the research security program training requirements in NSPM 33, I agree. I think a lot of what was listed in NSPM 33 translates well into the provisions of the Safeguarding American Innovation Act. So I do think that this is kind of an attempt to reconcile what is a guidance document into legislation. For what it's worth, the Innovation and Competition Act does actually direct the government to adopt NSPM 33 and its kind of provisions or a successor policy document. So I think largely that is an attempt to kind of reconcile those outstanding requirements. For export controlled, I'm happy to send a link to the specific language in the bill so that you can kind of take a look at it. And I agree, screening for deemed export concerns, working through any of those licensing provisions is absolutely something you should already be doing. I think the real change here is the need to proactively submit a plan to the Department of State that's going to detail how you're going to guard against any unauthorized access, which theoretically should be part of a technology control plan if one is already developed. It's a little bit more on that kind of proactive identification and reporting side. So I'm happy to send that along after the webinar. Lastly, the question about submitting any patents or licensing patents with with Chinese affiliates. Candidly, this is not my area of expertise. And so Christine or Mark, if you have anything else to add here, please feel free. The one thing I would say is that Strategic Competition Act, not the bill that was passed, but the one that's kind of outstanding, does look more closely at investment in foreign companies, any sort of organizations affiliated with foreign governments. So I would look to that to see if there is anything that's changing in how some of that intellectual property related work will play out. But I'm not sure, Christine or Mark, if you've got anything else to add there.
I really don't. Happy to say I'm many things, but patent lawyer is not one of them. So for the moment, I'll turn to enforcement, which is perhaps a less happy topic, but an important one. So I'm going to sort of tee up sort of just general trends, and then Mark will talk about some of the publicly sort of reported cases or the ones that are in process. But effectively, NIH has sort of really been at the forefront of trying to ferret out relationships of concern. And as of April of this year, based on Mike Lauer's testimony before one of the Senate committees, they've identified more than 500 scientists of concern, causing them to reach out to institutions about more than 200 of those individuals. Those individuals account for more than 300 active awards, and there are more than 90 institutions that are involved. So just to give you a sense of the scale of their review. They've certainly reviewed more than 500. If you think about 500 identified as scientists of concern, the number that they're reviewing is obviously substantially larger than that. And so then the question becomes, so what did NIH find concerning about these individuals? So really, as of last summer, they identified that more than 54% of the scientists of concern had failed to disclose their participation in a foreign talent program. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see those programs so heavily focused on in the pending legislation, because it has been discussed, for quite some time now. And roughly 70% failed to disclose at least one foreign grant. And in NIH's view, that really raises questions about whether or not sensitive IP may have been inappropriately transferred to foreign countries, if there are potential national security risks, and then, sort of more, not necessarily mundane, but routine concerns about scientific overlap and conflicts of commitment that may have caused the agency to make a different funding decision. Had they known that the person also had a federal grant from another country, they may have decided to fund someone else's research, had they known about that additional support. And so among those types of cases, NIH has said that they are reassured in part because more than 100 individuals have been barred by their home institution or NIH from serving as a PI or applying for new awards. So, when they are identifying and raising with institutions concerns about particular individuals, institutions are, for the most part, stepping up and taking action to try to correct where possible and where something may have been done inappropriately to take action to preclude that from happening again. And along those lines, that's included referrals to other law enforcement. So 78 referrals to ONS and more than 30 referrals to OIG. Obviously, some of those go through OIG to get to the Department of Justice. Others involve direct referrals to the Department of Justice. And Mark will talk a little bit about sort of where those cases sit and what they look like.
Great, thanks, Christine. So the map we're looking at here shows enforcement actions across the US by location. So we're talking about indictments, complaints, plea agreements, civil settlements that have been made public. And the size of each of these circles corresponds to the number of actions brought in a given location. So, we see big blots over large academic hubs like Boston and Southern California, which we might expect. But we can see that actions are being brought nationwide. And for example, you see a big blot over Ohio, a dot in Michigan that corresponds to an institution's False Claims Act settlement, and a number of other actions across the South, Plains, and Southwest. And so moving on to the next slide, based on a survey of 22 federal cases, we see the types of charges brought and the number of occurrences. And it's pretty obvious that wire fraud, which is often used as a kind of a catch-all statute, is by far the most common charge. One example is an associate engineering professor accused of hiding his relationship with a Chinese university from NASA and from his home institution in the US. It's important to note that with respect to NASA funding, there's a direct prohibition on using NASA funds to collaborate with Chinese-owned entities, which does include universities. And researchers have to attest to compliance with these Chinese funding restrictions, and the researcher in this case did attest here. That researcher was charged with both wire fraud and making false statements. The wire fraud charges concerned emails transmitting allegedly fraudulent attestations and invoices, and the false statements related to content of payment invoices and associated certifications. So there, the government also alleged, among other things, that the professor used NASA-funded research for a publication that was submitted to a Chinese military-run journal. And this was actually the first of these types of cases to go to trial. And in fact, just yesterday ended with a hung jury and a mistrial. Especially notable is that the defense in this case focused squarely on the researcher's US institution. He argued that the university employees struggled to understand and explain unclear disclosure and conflict of interest policies. He argued that he didn't hide his affiliation from the US institution and was confused about what he was supposed to report. And he also argued that the university told him to sign the attestation, but never explained the restrictions to him. And then moving on, you can see that false statements is the next most frequent charge. One quick example here is a researcher that pled guilty to making false statements to NIH on grant applications. There, he failed to disclose his 1,000 Talents program participation on conflict of interest forms and in grant applications, and reportedly used NIH funds to develop foreign expertise abroad. So the researcher was actually arrested boarding a charter flight in Anchorage and was carrying laptops, cell phones, and USB drives, among other things. And the result was that he was sentenced to 37 months in prison and was ordered to pay $3.4 million in restitution to NIH and also $413,000 to his institution. This is one of the cases in which the government directly alleges that government funds were used to benefit another government, which is a factor that we don't actually see in all of these cases. Also, you see a significant number of visa fraud charges, which have involved, for example, visiting researchers who failed to report service in the Chinese military, and also some involving theft related to programs, receiving federal funds, and theft of trade secrets. I think this is an interesting point because there aren't quite as many of those as you might expect, based on an initiative that is largely rooted in protecting intellectual property. And then finally, we see an emerging trend of charges related to personal financial crimes. We're talking about filing false tax returns, failing to report foreign bank accounts valued at
Mark, I think we lost your audio. We'll let you fix the audio, though, but there have been a couple of recent cases involving taxes and bank accounts. That appears to be sort of a new trend. I think we've now seen it in 3 or 4 cases. So these numbers may be a little bit out of date, and I think that trend will continue. The penalties for those personal financial crimes can be quite hefty. And prosecutors are likely using those in an attempt to try to get to plea agreements with multiple individuals.
Thanks, Christine. Am I back?
You're back.
Excellent. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide, please. So here, looking at the same 22 cases, we see a host of less frequently charged crimes. I'm going to talk about just one of them, the False Claims Act. This case involved a $5.5 million civil settlement by a research institution. That institution settled claims that it had submitted NIH grant applications for 2 researchers, which didn't disclose their Chinese grant funding, including from the 1,000 Talents program. And the government's press release in this settlement listed allegations that the institution should have known about the Chinese funding and disclosed it to NIH, that they had learned about the funding, but instead of confirming it and disclosing it, and instead chose to remove references to the funding in a related press release. And also that the institution didn't report overlap between NIH and foreign funding for those researchers without actually knowing if the statement was true. Move on to the next.
So lots to chew on there. So with the agency, congressional, and enforcement landscapes that we've outlined, we want to now shift the conversation to ways in which each of your institutions can create, enhance, or modify your compliance efforts in this space. And we fully acknowledge that there is not a one-size-fits-all solution to these types of issues. And every institution needs to assess its own overall risk tolerance and its available resources, and then work to balance those two things to develop and implement a plan that can materially reduce risk without breaking the bank. We move to the next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about assessing institutional risk tolerance. And here we really mean putting yourself somewhere on the sliding scale of very conservative or risk averse to, aggressive or risk tolerant, and sort of examining where you are on that scale. And we've listed here just a few ways in which institutions can start thinking about their level of risk tolerance. So for example, a prior history of enforcement actions or agency investigations. If you've already had these types of situations come up, or you've had faculty members who have been investigated or arrested or have active cases, that may likely put you into a more conservative posture in terms of how you're going to set up your program, both to demonstrate to the agency that you take the incidents that have already occurred seriously, but also to try and avoid any future investigations or imposed compliance plans from an agency. Second, obviously, your reliance on federal funding. If your institution has a small amount of federal funding as your overall research budget, you may be willing to take on a little bit more risk because if you needed to pay the money back or stop certain research activities, it wouldn't be material to the operations of the organization. Financial stability, or the ability to repay or unwind relationships that are deemed problematic. Many institutions will choose, once an issue is identified, to go at risk or to stop drawdowns on federal funded research for some period of time while they take a look at things. That's not feasible for every institution. And if it's not feasible for you, you may want to be more conservative upfront to try and avoid troubles down the road. The degree of research you do in countries of concern, or the collaborations that you have with countries of concern, would also be an issue. Here, I would just note that while the federal government has really focused on the 4 countries that we talked about in terms of the talent programs, the state of Florida, I think, has a list of 8 or 9 countries of concern. And so, that may shift over time. And so this isn't sort of a set your risk tolerance and just proceed. It's something that's going to be recalibrated over time. And then also technologies of concern. The federal government has been fairly transparent about the areas that they're most concerned with. It makes sense to look at, see how much research do you have in those areas, and how is that data secured, stored, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Christine, and a good segue into looking at your available resources as well. All of our jobs would be significantly easier if we had droves of well-qualified and well-trained staff and sophisticated technology and processes that worked all of the time, and that was what was supporting us, in our daily lives. But that's not the reality for anyone I know. So I think it's pretty practical to start looking at what you have available now, what you can reasonably expect to get access to in the short term, and then thinking more strategically about what you do want to plan for in the long term. For example, we're seeing a lot of clients start to enhance disclosure related systems to start asking questions about things like in-kind support, or proactively collecting some of these contracts that we talked about are going to have to be disclosed. That's great. It takes time, it takes money, and implementing a system isn't effective immediately. That might be okay for your institution, but if you're incredibly risk averse because of enforcement action or financial issues, or you just frankly don't have the budget for a capital expenditure like that, it might be something that you have to consider doing a little bit differently. So to exactly what Christine was saying earlier, we want to be really attenuated to institutions really needing to take lots of different approaches to make something work for where you're at. The other comment I just want to make here is that I think, a lot of people think that risk tolerance is driving this conversation, and it needs to. I think it's very prudent to think about what your risk tolerance is, somewhat agnostic to your resources to start. But in reality, that really has to be a more symbiotic relationship. Being extremely risk averse and having limited resources is just really setting yourself up for failure. So especially for those of you that are working in research operations and kind of on the front lines of dealing with this, I think you play a really important role in having these conversations with your compliance officers, with your counsel, to make it clear what you do when you don't have and what is and is not going to work for your institution, so that you've got a clear perspective of kind of where you're going to fall on this, and kind of getting others aligned to the reality of that day to day. Essentially, I'm describing a process of doing a risk assessment, thinking about what the risk is, what's the likelihood, what do you already have in the form of a control. Hopefully those are things that you guys are already familiar with and can pretty easily apply to things like research security. So I'm going to turn it actually back over to Christine to talk about some of the areas that we would ideally like to see risk assessments done around for research security purposes.
Thanks. So, now that we've outlined sort of those variables, both to consider in terms of risk tolerance and resources, the hope is that multidisciplinary teams within each of your institutions can start to apply those criteria to specific activities and then develop action items and priority plans. And so we've listed a number of activities or issues that have come up repeatedly, both in NIH investigations, even when those have not led to problems, but sort of thinking about how are they looking at these issues and what are they likely to surface as potential red flags, as well as the types of things that we have seen that have driven enforcement actions. So we've listed things like foreign travel, academic appointments, obviously talent programs, which we've talked about a number of times today. Authorship review, so looking for references in individual publications where someone may be citing both a US federally funded award, but also an award from a country of concern, and being able to go to the professor, not in an accusatory way, but to understand what really is the relationship. And some of this can be as simple as talking, with faculty members about what the actual requirements or protocols are for listing awards that may have been supportive. So sometimes, we have seen situations where a graduate student who used to work in their lab and only worked on a project in the US goes back and returns to their home country and is now supported by a foreign award, but it really had nothing to do with this particular project. And yet that foreign award is cited as a source of support for an article that came out and can raise unnecessary questions. As you go through each of these activities, you can then look at both your risk tolerance and your resources, and you can make different choices. So you can choose to prohibit certain arrangements, even if they're not required to be prohibited because they're just too risky for where you are at the moment. You could require disclosure, either via existing financial conflict of interest or outside reporting processes. You could require prior approval, whether it be by a department chair, a dean, or a central office, or impose limitations on the type or number of appointments that someone can accept to try to keep the number of things that you need to review manageable.
Yeah, I think those are all really great points. We've talked a few times too about just the number of stakeholders that are involved. So hearkening a little bit back to our earlier polling question, there are just so many stakeholders relevant to a research security program. And we really do think that convening a group to serve as a standing committee or a working group is incredibly prudent. We've listed some common stakeholders here as a starting point. As operations leaders or compliance officers, or even as external counsel advising your institutions, it's really significant to have these partnerships with offices like travel and procurement, HR, certainly your security teams, faculty affairs. You want to get a holistic picture of where risk lives. Again, the controls that you already have, what might be reasonable to try to tighten or change, but then really rolling things out in a unified fashion and kind of taking this as an institution together. This is really, the topic of foreign influence is such an example of how changes to a single office can have a real and immediate downstream impact on other offices. So, the idea that you've got a group together to already stay coordinated, that you can kind of perk your ears up to and know if things are changing or that they're kind of being discussed, and get on top of that. I think it's also really nice to have a group to go back to as things change. As you've heard us talking, there's been just a slew of regulatory, legislative, enforcement action changes, even just in the last 6 months as we've been talking about this webinar. Making sure that you've got a group to communicate with and get some education around and really kind of do some of this team building, I think is just so important to make sure that you're handling this holistically as an institution. But in our last 15 minutes, we wanted to have a discussion about really how to apply this risk tolerance. So we're going to talk through a couple of different examples around how institutions are looking at kind of two discrete problems. But first wanted to get a sense of how your institutions are responding to this NIH requirement to provide these translated copies of contracts, especially as Christine earlier, as NIH clarified that NIH will accept machine translations. We've really been hearing about institutions taking different approaches to meeting this, all really dependent on what's available, what your tolerance is. Again, if you had all the budget and time in the world, you could get a certified copy of everything. But again, that's probably not the reality for most places. And some of you might not really even be down this road yet, because we know the compliance date got pushed back. Maybe you don't have a ton of NIH funding, so you're kind of waiting this one out to see what happens elsewhere. So curious to just see where folks are at with a bit of a pulse check. So Grace, would you be able to share the polling results? Yeah, all right. So it looks like almost half really looking at a combination, which I think makes a lot of sense. Again, kind of if you're an institution that's a large university, you may have have some high risk research happening in engineering and certain parts of your arts and sciences, colleges, schools of medicine, what have you. And even within those, researchers that are doing more or less work with international institutions, more or less work with controlled or sensitive technology, so on and so forth. So I think that approach makes a lot of sense. A handful of folks using a free online service, a handful allowing the faculty member, student, or an outside organization to provide a translated copy. Interestingly, nobody's using a fee-based online service. I know, Mark, you've got some thoughts about that, so I'm going to actually turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. Those, they have their pluses and minuses. The fee-based services are very easy to use and cheap, often marginally better than a machine translation that's free on the internet. So it's good for bulk. It's good for getting it done quickly, but not great for accuracy in our experience. But thanks everyone for your answers to the polling questions. Next, we're going to talk about some sample menus of options which cover a few different issues that you might encounter. Understanding that at some point the requirement to provide for and outside activity contracts is coming, our first menu is going to discuss how you might handle this based on risk tolerance. So across the top of this slide, we list 3 potential options for handling the contracts, ranging from risk averse on the left over to risk tolerant on the right. And at the bottom, you'll see a number of risk tolerance factors which affect different parts of the tolerance spectrum. So first, at the top left, we see the option to review all foreign contracts prior to execution and approve or deny participation. So what we're saying is that a risk averse approach might be to kind of act as a gatekeeper before the arrangement is even executed. Then somewhere in the middle, you might require researchers to at least provide the contracts to you after they've been executed, so that someone at the institution is at least aware that they exist. You could collect them locally, maybe at the school or department level, or centrally through research administration, which also might depend on your risk tolerance. And then third, on the top right, the risk tolerant approach might be to just have the researchers give you contracts they have sometime prior to submitting proposals or progress reports, which would allow the institution to assess conflicts of interest, disclosure requirements, et cetera, just in time to make accurate submissions. So the approach you're going to take is probably going to depend on a lot of factors. We can see that institutional factors like culture, training, change management affect the whole spectrum. And so on that point, risk-averse approaches are going to require more institutional resources like personnel, systems, funding, maybe even new processes. So your options might be limited off the bat by those factors. And the next, kind of using the top left menu option as an example, acting as a gatekeeper, the most risk-averse one. If your institution's culture is such that you can exercise some degree of control over faculty members' outside activities, this might work for you. But at the other end of the spectrum, if your researchers enjoy a lot of freedom and discretion when it comes to engaging in outside activities, and therefore might resist such an approach, this might not work for you. Moving down, looking at history of enforcement, what we mean here is that if a researcher has had non-disclosure issues in the past, or maybe is tough to get information from in a timely manner, you might want to review those contracts prior to execution, or at least have them provide them to you after the fact, as opposed to waiting until the time that submissions are due. On the other hand, if your researcher is a model citizen when it comes to compliance and timely grant submissions, then the risk tolerant approach of waiting until submission is due might work for you. And then lastly, if a researcher has had extensive or really high profile engagement with countries of concern, or maybe works with sensitive technologies, the risk-averse approach might be ideal if you can manage it. But then on the other hand, if your institution has the resources to return or rescind funding if problems arrive, like Christine mentioned, you might be willing to accept more risk on that point. On to our next menu.
Yeah, so I'm going to, I think, do a little bit of contrasting that just with the resources that are available. Mark spoke a little bit to this already, but again, not surprising on that, on kind of the risk-averse side of the continuum, the idea that you're going to need more resources, I think follows quite naturally. But it's also, I think, worth stepping back and thinking about some of the implications of that. So, for example, I talked a little bit about disclosure systems before. So thinking about the processes and the human resources that go along with that. If you want to review and approve this contracts, as Mark said, you've got to have a process to do that. You need to know who's going to review it, what they're reviewing it for. What are you going to do if you want to actually disapprove a contract or tell a faculty member that they can't move forward with this? Thinking again about that culture and change management. Who's going to take that message back to the faculty? How is that going to play out in your faculty governance structures and some of these conversations about academic freedom and kind of even activities associated with trying to get things like tenure? All of those things I think really come into play and are very important for faculty to consider and important for administrators to think about and kind of communicating these messages. Even looking at some of these kind of standard process components, do you have a rubric that's going to help your reviewers kind of work their way through some of these questions? Do you know what your standards are? Everything from how much time you might allow someone to spend away from work to looking at some of the more kind of at-risk arrangements like foreign talent program participation. I would then contrast that with something on the risk tolerant side that says, if you're not going to collect contracts at all, how are you going to handle obtaining them when they're needed for compliance with the NIH requirement, or if some of these legislative provisions move forward around providing foreign talent program contracts as well? Are you going to put in any processes to validate whether the individuals listed on a proposal or an award have any outside activity? Are you going to look at something that gets disclosed through an annual disclosure process, or perhaps looking at a proposal or an award level attestation that folks are signing, perhaps in addition to having to sign off on their other support? And then are you going to have time to get things like translated copies, right? If you want to get a certified translated copy, it's probably not reasonable to only ask for that contract when just in time comes in or when a funding proposal is being submitted. So these are really the kinds of things that operations leaders can really chime in on and give some context for how these things kind of, again, actually really play out in the real world. I think anyone who has supported an NIH deadline knows how hectic those days get, and tacking on some of these additional requirements really a point in time can can be really overwhelming. But simultaneously, those of us that have worked on the conflicts of interest side know how sensitive those disclosures are already. They're already perceived as being kind of overly burdensome. So the idea of having to ask for more than you absolutely need isn't necessarily a great position to be in either. So again, I think it's really about starting to think about what you truly need to do, and then what you actually can do, right? And kind of making that balance. So again, maybe you're an institution, you can afford to invest in a system to automate some of this collection and review, produce a report that your grants managers can use. That's great. If you're not, can you start to look at your high-risk departments, your high-risk investigators, folks in engineering, physicians that are working with biohazards, people that do a lot of commercialization activity, or perhaps bring in several international postdocs into their lab. Just looking at folks that might raise the red flag a little bit from an enforcement perspective. Focus your efforts there, really starting to think about getting some bang from your buck, and working with those types of high risk departments and individuals to, provide them with education and really help them to understand that you're trying to do this to protect them. As I think Mark talked about, this enforcement action has really primarily been with individuals. So I think it is a nice opportunity to shift some of the tone from truly, we're just trying to put paperwork in place and, it's burdensome, to this is a real threat. This is happening to your colleagues, and, and we're trying to help you guard against that. We're almost out of time, but I am going to quickly turn back one more menu on visiting scholars. I think that's Christine.
Sure. So again, sort of looking at the risk-averse approach to a risk-tolerant approach. A risk-averse approach for visitors would require central office approval and access provisioning, whereas a moderate approach might delegate that down to the departmental level with central approval, sort of for more limited purposes. A risk tolerant may just allow departments to go ahead and handle things sort of independently. And again, we've got a number of different factors from a sort of risk tolerance perspective. How many visitors do you have coming in? What type of research might they have access to if they are going to be in your labs or in other facilities? Do you have minimal amounts of research in high risk technologies? Knowing that nanotechnology, genetics, anything that could be used as a bioweapon are all areas where you may need to be more conservative about visitors. And this doesn't apply just to people who are coming in for a short period of time to give a lecture or have a tour. I would also be thinking about sort of short-term fellowships or visiting scholar for 1 to 2 year timeframes. In the same mix. As we now know, NIH and other agencies have expressed concern about supported scholars from foreign countries, particularly those associated with certain programs where they may need to, as a condition of their funding, report to the consulate or back to their home government as to what it is that they're working on. And so they are incentivized, encouraged, or required to provide information that we may not want or we may not know is being shared. It's possible, again, sort of on the risk-averse side, to simply say we're not going to take supported scholars unless we've done some real due diligence on who's providing the funding and are convinced that it doesn't cause a problem. You may eliminate them altogether, or you may limit the types of work that they're able to do when they're in the lab or the amount of time that they're there. So all different ways that this could be handled. But really, we just sort of create the matrix to, sort of facilitate conversation among that sort of multidisciplinary group to figure out what will work for you.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it about what's going to work for you. And I know we're at time, so just on resources, I think exactly like what Christine was saying, figuring out what is going to work for your institution, and then making some of these associated determinations, particularly around things like templatized agreements, provisioning access. This is really a process that has tended, I think, to live in departments that folks are really looking at centralizing now. So working through some of those change management related activities. And then even if it is going to continue to live with departments, spending some time with any resources that you have to develop those, again, those templatized agreements, some training and education on how and what to provision access, just any of those considerations I think can be incredibly helpful. Again, I know we're at time, so I do just want to thank everyone for attending today. It's such an evolving topic. Any of us are happy to take questions, and thank you for chiming in throughout. And then feel free to send a note to any of us afterwards. As I said, the recording will be available in about a week. We'll get that sent out, but any of us are happy to take questions over email or have any conversations afterward, particularly as this continues to evolve. So thanks again, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.